Hi again and welcome to the Talkingbass podcast. This week, Ellen is sitting down to talk bass with the amazing Bryan Beller. Bryan Beller has played with guitar legends such as Mike Kenneally, Steve Vai, Joe Satriani, Dweezil Zappa, and has spent the last 10 years as bass player for supergroup the Aristocrats with guitar phenomenon Guthrie Govan and drum legend Marco Minnemann. As well as his real-world music ventures, Bryan has also played bass for the fictional animated death metal band Dethklok. In this interview, Bryan gives some insight into his bass background and how he developed a successful music career over many years. He's a very open guy with a lot of awesome advice, so without further ado, let's join Ellen as she sits down to talk bass with the fantastic Bryan Beller.
Hello and welcome to the Talkingbass podcast with me, your host Ellen O'Reilly, and my guest today, the amazing Bryan Beller.
Hello, thank you, Ellen, for having me. Everybody, hi, welcome to my kitchen. I have I'd love to be able to show you all the cool music stuff I have on my desk that's all in front of me, but it's all in front of me, and that's where the camera is, and that's where the monitor is, and then that's the other part of the room. So everybody, welcome. You're all welcome at my house. You don't want me to cook for you, but you're still welcome.
Well, it's nearly dinner time here in Ireland, so I'm like, yeah, cook me over some noodles. Sure, it's morning for you there, isn't it?
That's about as well as I can do. At least some noodles.
But that's where you're cooking all your amazing bass lines.
Yes, right here. They all happen right here. Especially over the last year while we've all been stuck at home. Mm.
Yeah. Well, I reckon that you're definitely the kind of person who would have been very proactive and just thought, right now I've got time, write a load of music, practice loads. Whereas I'm just going to sit around and drink a lot.
Can I tell you something? A reputation will carry you far, because the truth is, even though, yes, in the past I may have had a rep for kind of being a real DIY go-getter and busting ass all the time, I have really taken the opportunity over this last year to go slower. I have not launched into this is the time I'm going to do that big project that I always wanted to do and never had time to. And kind of the reason is because if anything fits that characteristic, it would be the big solo album I put out in 2019, a double progressive concept album called Scenes from the Flood. It's got 18 songs on it. It's 88 minutes. I put it out on double vinyl, and Joe Satriani and John Petrucci and Guthrie's on it, and Mike Dawes, amazing British guitarist, and all sorts of other people are on it. And I spent 3 years working on it. That would have been exactly the kind of project that if I had had this time, I would have sat down and done. But it's done already. So I've just really kind of taken the opportunity for once in my life to go a little bit slower. And it's been very, very rewarding, I have to say. I mean, I think maybe there's a lot of pressure on creatives, especially right out of the gate. You saw people posting all these videos, right away, that we've got to do something. We can't just do nothing. I don't think that's true. I think that we need, the tank needs to be refilled. We need input from the world in order to turn it around into creative output that we can get back. So I'm just kind of gathering input and working on a few things that we can talk about in the interview.
Absolutely. Well, I always like to go back to the beginning when I talk to a bass player, especially one as successful as you. How did you get into music? Were you from a musical family or background?
I wasn't. I'm from a regular old middle-class Jewish family in the northeast of the United States, and my dad is a lawyer, and my mom was a teacher, and my grandparents had regular jobs, and nobody had a profession in the arts. There were some piano players. My grandma played piano, my mom played piano, but there was no background, even in my extended family, of anybody who had a profession in the arts. So I was kind of starting cold in that way. But so I started tinkering around on piano when I was a kid, and then they gave me piano lessons, classical piano lessons, starting when I was 8 years old. And then I joined the school orchestra when I was 10 and started playing upright bass, playing Eine Kleine Nacht music and stuff like that. And that got a little bit old for me quickly, and then I switched to electric when I was 13. Strangely enough, I've told this story before, I apologize if anybody's heard it, but I wasn't really excited about playing acoustic bass, but the Stray Cats came along and they had this song called Rock This Town. If you're not familiar with the Stray Cats, it's an old kind of rockabilly send-up band from the 80s. Brian Setzer was the guitarist. They could really play. And they had a really specific thing they did, the real 50s rockabilly thing. And so that song had this bass line that was like, ba-doom-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. I'm like, finally, something cool that I could do on acoustic bass. And I shredded my hands in an hour. They were just destroyed. I couldn't believe how much they hurt. I was just like, this is stupid. I want to play electric. So I started playing electric because of the Stray Cats at age
So wasn't
13.
13. That is great. That is like the age. I was way too old. I was like 17. I wish I kind of was 13.
Oh, I think you know what? I wasn't really serious until I got to Berkeley. I played in bands and learned stuff off of records and everything, but you know, I could have been a lot more. I was not a music kind of prodigious, you know, just kind of getting after it when I was a kid, practicing 8 hours a day. I mean, you know, you think about the Aristocrats, you know, both Guthrie Govan and Marco Minnemann, I think they started playing when they were 4 years old or something like that. That's a much more kind of typical course for people who end up in our genre. I was busy getting in trouble and smoking pot, you know. I didn't get serious until I got to Berklee College of Music finally when I was 18. And then I was like, wow, if I'm going to do this, I better do it for real.
Brilliant. I mean, yeah, but that's already like a tough place to get into, like, so. Oh, the fan.
Just realized that I had a fan going. It was maybe causing some background noise for you. I turned it off.
That's all good. That's all good. But like, so after you heard the Stray Cats and then you busted up your hands and then you started playing electric. So once you started playing electric, who were your early influences?
John Paul Jones was my big early influence. You know, I just wanted to groove and play in a rock band. I really just wanted to play with John Bonham. I was like, John, can you just like come over and like, can we jam? You know, that wasn't possible. So I just bought a bunch of Led Zeppelin albums and I just played along with them. And that was my first, you know, I remember, you know, trying to learn The Song Remains the Same, the song and the Lemon song and just the basics, you know, all the Ramble On, you know, that bass line really got to me. I love the dark, smooth tone that he had, which is, you know, a funny thing considering where a lot of my tonal stuff ended up. But I just wanted to groove. I was not so much into like, you know, the Billy Sheehan, Stu Hamm extended technique stuff. That stuff is great, and I love that they were doing it, but I kind of instinctively shied away from it in some way. You know, I played along with Rush albums. That was kind of like as far as I was willing to go with that. Like I played a lot of Geddy Lee stuff early on, and Chris Squire, even though I wasn't playing with a pick, I loved Yes, and so I liked learning those lines. But I also liked playing along with like Pink Floyd, which is like the simplest, most basic stuff as far as bass playing is concerned. But I just loved the songs. I loved the composition. I loved the sound. I loved where it all sat. So that was my early stuff. And then there was Metallica. I was a metal guy. So I was really interested to see, like, you know, I heard hearing Cliff Burton get that distorted wah tone. That I was really curious about that from an early age, and that ended up being a part of my main pedal setup, like well into adulthood. I still have it today. I still use it as a solo voice. I think it's really great. And then when I got into college, you know, went to Berkeley, I started getting into other fusion stuff. Of course, I went through a Jocko thing, and I got into the Chick Corea Electric Band and John Patitucci, even though I'm not a jazz guy at all. I just loved the earthiness and the rootsiness that he brought to almost like an R&B feel that he brought to his jazz fusion stuff. And then Tim Commerford from Rage Against the Machine was a big influence on how I wanted my overdriven bass sound to sound and feel. That was a big deal. And then there was a guy named Scott Tunis, who was the bass player for Frank Zappa's touring bands in the 1980s. And even though tonally I wasn't really doing his thing, which is slamming a P bass with a pick, basically as hard as you can, but he was a classically trained guy who could like kind of produce, you know, melodic counterpoint on demand and reharmonize anything, no matter how complex, and putting these like really interesting counterintuitive bass lines in compositions where you wouldn't think that they would fit, but they actually enhanced and generated an additional level of kind of complexity and melody. So he was a kind of a, I would say, a cerebral influence on my playing, a way to make rock and, you know, kind of experimental rock, instrumental rock, rock fusion more interesting as a bass player.
Very cool, very cool. Well, I'd like to. I'm just trying to see what it was like to study at Berkeley. Like, I mean, what was a like typical? What was it? What were you studying there? You know.
Well, it's different back then. It's different than it is now. I mean, there's. I think there's a lot more. There's a lot more emphasis on mainstream kind of pop and rock. You know, back then it was really a jazz school. It was very nerdy. and now you walk around and it looks like the set of American Idol. It's super weird. Doesn't mean they're not still doing jazz and producing great musicians, but the vibe has definitely changed. But back in the late 1980s and early 1990s when I was there, the curriculum itself was very, very jazz focused, and you had to try hard to find rock people to play with, and there was a couple of guitar teachers who were teaching a rock curriculum. There was like one bass player who kind of touched on it, but he was really still kind of a jazz fusion-y guy at heart. There was no rock bass player key instructor at the Berklee bass department back then. There was a couple of great Motown guys, who were like, if you want to get started with like, hey, you want to know where John Paul Jones got all his stuff from? Hey, check out James Jamerson. There were people who didn't know that. I wasn't super hip to that. I knew it, but I didn't know it. And so we went deep into that kind of thing. But if you wanted to play like contemporary rock with other people at Berklee who wanted to play contemporary rock, like if you wanted to play like, Living Colour or Fishbone or Red Hot Chili Peppers or like, even metal, anything that was like going on at the time, you kind of had to do it outside the curriculum. And Berklee had a cafeteria where you could stage shows. It was kind of outside the system, even though there was an informal system for doing it there. And so that's what I did, the regular jazz curriculum. I made a decision kind of halfway on. I was like, either I'm going to learn all the Charlie Parker solos and kind of get all the way into this and be able to play jazz for real, or I'm not. And I just decided kind of at an early age that I wasn't going to be that guy, because I wasn't really listening to that music, I wasn't motivated and inspired by that music, even though I appreciate it and I love watching it. It just wasn't inside me. So I learned what I needed to learn in order to, pass the curriculum. And then, my passion was organizing shows where I could play the music that I really loved, and there was some fusion in there, but it was mostly kind of classic progressive rock. And then some of the more modern kind of funk rock stuff that was going on at the time. I put together this band that was like a 20-piece band with like horns and background vocalists and 2 guitars and keyboards and percussion. And we called ourselves Cosmic Chicken, and we did all this stuff. And it was a lot of fun. But, what was going on was, so as a bass player, you can imagine, it was the late 80s. I'm like going, I'm slapping and, all those things. I don't really do that stuff anymore, but back then it was a thing. And we had a lot of fun, but I just wanted to be in a band that sounded good, that I could be the bass player for. It wasn't important for me to be like out front doing extended technique, showing, how I could revolutionize the instrument. That wasn't really where I was coming from. I just wanted to be a part of a great band. And so, I took it upon myself to kind of organize some of those shows. And then eventually I met the drummer who got me my start in LA. His name was Joe Travers, who was a big Frank Zappa fan. And he moved to Los Angeles and got the gig with Dweezil Zappa. And then 6 months later, he got me an audition. And then I moved out there to join him. So that's how it all started, because he was playing in the project bands with me at Berklee. So it was really kind of like a networking success story as much as anything, which is a lesson for everybody, because that's the whole industry in a way. You can be the greatest player in the world in your bedroom. If you're not out there meeting people and, letting people know that you are a player who does X and is available for work, then how are you ever going to get called for anything?
That's it, absolutely. That's what I tell myself when I'm propping up the bar at every pub. I'm networking.
But you are.
Yeah.
Yeah, all those pints are tax deductible.
That's what I tell the tax man. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, right as soon as you completed the course and then boom, straight out to LA.
Yeah, like I had gone to some kind of trade school or something. I got my engineering degree and now I got a job at a firm. It was really weird, actually, because I know that's not the story for most people. And the truth is I was planning on moving to New York. I was in a blues rock band at the time. We were writing original material, and we had this big plan to go to the New York area and kind of take a go at it. But a couple weeks before we all moved, I got that audition, and I kind of bailed on the whole thing. It wasn't that there was some aspects about that weren't exactly lovely, but that's the business. You got to take an opportunity when you have it. So, yeah, and that didn't mean I knew what I was doing, by the way. I was out there playing on professional stages. Like, I think my first gig was on my first really public gig was on national television on the Conan O'Brien show back in 1994. And I was so scared I could barely breathe. Like, there's there's no camera shots of me in that performance because I think every single time the camera was on me, they probably would have captured this face. You know? So it took a little while for me to get my sea legs around the whole thing, playing professionally for people. It was, you know, it wasn't natural.
That's amazing though. I mean, straight in there with Dweezil Zappa, you know?
Yeah, but you know, it's like anything, especially I think this is true of music, there's just no way to replicate in any school the education of like just spending a few weeks on tour. You learn, and let's just bring it back to bass playing. You just learn so much about the sound that you want to have while you're playing. That I think is the number one thing. It was for me anyway. It was just like, okay, I'm playing the right notes, and I'm on stage. Somebody's paying me. How come I'm not having a fulfilling experience while I'm playing? It's because I can't hear myself as well as I'd like, or the sound that I'm hearing is not really kind of making me, you know, get into the music and want to play. It's because instead I'm thinking about, oh, is there enough treble? I can't really hear these articulations. Why is this so boomy? Blah, blah, blah. And so that really kind of began a lifelong journey for me in really trying to refine what my sound was and how I could translate what I heard in my head and what I could perfect on my own into a room of 100 people, 300 people, 500 people, 1,000 people, more, whatever. Because in the end, that's what people take away. You know, they take away what they've heard and the quality and the peculiarity of somebody's sound. So if you don't have that kind of really dialed in, then you're missing a big part of the picture. Now, when you're 23, you don't know that. Maybe you do if you're some kind of really, really advanced person. Or maybe you had people in your family or you grew up around professionals who were giving you the inside information about, hey, listen, you're going to come across this. You need to check this out, whatever. I didn't have any of that. I had to learn by trial and error, mostly error.
Yeah. And well, elaborate on that. Like, how did you discover your own sound then?
Well, you know, I knew that there were people who I liked listening to sounded good. You know, I mentioned John Paul Jones, but in the end, that wasn't the sound that I really started to kind of zero in on as something that I wanted to go for. I kind of wanted a combination of like John Patitucci's clean sound and Tim Comerford's from Rage Against the Machine's aggressive sound. So I essentially started zeroing in on a bright jazz bass sound, but not bright like Marcus Miller. You know, not bright in like with a lot of mid-range scooped out. I wanted it to be bright, but also when I stepped on an overdrive pedal, I wanted there to be a lot of character in the upper mids, like around 1K and 2K. I apologize for the non-nerds out there who don't know what those frequencies mean, but it's just a very, you know, that snarly frequency. And then to be able to manage how much of that I wanted to deliver with my hand, using it as a kind of a gain, increaser or decreaser. And in order to be able to do that, you have to be operating at a kind of a high gain environment so that your hand dynamics really will make a difference, as opposed to an environment where if you feel like you have to play, you can't really hear yourself unless you're playing hard. That's like, you've just lost the plot if that's where you are in terms of delivering consistent tone to people. You need to be able to play normally, like you're playing in a room just for yourself, and the same kind of pressure and velocity, and be able to intentionalize those tones the same way that you would if you're on a stage. Now, that requires a lot of trial and error, and a lot of different environments and different volume levels on stage, different kinds of music, different venues, different everything. But I started to zero in, like I said, on a clean, sweet, bright sound that could be, you know, ramped up into a very aggressive, overdriven sound if I wanted it to be. But as I got older, you know, that's not the only sound in the toolbox. You know, I do have, you know, like I said, I have this bass right here, this Micro Modern 5 with the ash body and the maple top and the maple fingerboard and the Seymour Duncan 6770 pickups. It's a brightness machine. It's designed to be bright. The tone woods, the fingerboard, it's all, you know, those things all matter. But then, you know, I have an instrument like this, which has an alder body with a maple top and an ebony fingerboard and EMG pickups, 40 DCs, and then the EMG BQC preamp. And this thing is designed to be kind of a much more modern sounding, like, for lack of a better phrase, Spectre-ish kind of sounding instrument with like a really kind of mid-range focus, a little bit compressy, a glassy top, you know, but not like super aggressive in the high mids. Something that like will focus and cut right through a metal mix, and has kind of a warmth to it, but like, you know, not a vintage warmth, a modern warmth. So, this is another instrument that I use a lot these days called the BBMF5. And then I have another instrument that I use a lot on the Aristocrats albums, and I use it live, which is a pure vintage machine. It's a 5-string passive PJ, alder body, rosewood fingerboard. I take the tone knob, I roll it almost all the way off. When you play it hard, the pickups break up a little bit, and they give you a little bit of that kind of, Stevie Wonder, I wish, that thing that Nathan Watts gets when he would go, you can hear a little bit of overdrive and pickups themselves. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about these things and how to translate signature sounds into, real world environments. I've certainly spent a lot more time thinking about that than practicing, my modes at 200 beats per minute or whatever, because that's not really my thing.
Yeah, but I've seen you live, and your sound is always fantastic. And I'm really happy that you say that about that punchy mid-range Spectre machine, because I love that sound. A lot of people, they complain about it because they're all about the vintage, but I like a good bit of mid-range punch. I think it's class, especially for rock stuff.
Well, that's right. Is that especially for metal stuff? That was I think people listening to Motorhead may have started to think that like the only legitimate metal bass sound was like a super overdriven thing, but that's actually, in modern metal especially, not true at all. You've got these really, really, what's the word I'm looking for? Extremely saturated guitar tones, compressed, shoved right to the front. And, more overdrive in the bass is going to get lost in that mix. If you try and make it up in low end, it gets lost in the kicks, and the kick drums are all over the place anyway because it's metal. And, I started listening to the idea, or started entertaining the idea that a Spectre would be a good instrument for these environments with 2 bass players. One is Dan Briggs from Between the Buried and Me, who's, he's considerably younger than me, but I listened to their album, The Great Misdirect, which is from 2009. I couldn't believe how clearly and warmly, and it's even still with a little bit of chime on top that cut through, that bass tone was cutting through these intense mixes and really complicated arrangements. And so I reached out, and he said he was using a Spectre. And then I also, I knew that Alex Webster from Cannibal Corpse had a signature Spectre. So I started getting interested in those, and I have a couple Spectres now. I have an Alex signature. I use it for recording, and I love the Spectres. But in the end, when I play live, and for 20 years, I've been a Mike Lowell guy. These Mike Lowell basses have been really the thing that allows me to fully realize myself live. They're bolt-ons, and that just feels different than a neck through. You can be a little bit more specific, a lot more specific actually, with the action and the setup. And the Spectres are great. I love them, and I was, PJ at Spectre, who I was working with, is a great guy. It's just that the way that their instruments feel, I felt like I could never get 100% of myself out when I was playing live, because the neck spacing was a little small, or just because the way the thing was weighted. There's so many factors that go into playing comfort, as they say. So yeah. But is that a Spectre behind you?
No, Sandberg.
That's another good bass. There's a lot of great basses out there.
It's my babies.
Yeah, is that a Sandberg P?
PJ configuration on both of them. Well, actually, there's a Music Man soap bar situation on the 5-string there in the middle.
Okay.
And then I've got a split pickup, and then this is a PJ config.
It's interesting, a PJ with a maple fingerboard.
Yeah, I know, I'm weird, aren't I?
I didn't say it. Yeah. But I'm curious. So now, they all have maple fingerboards. So what makes you reach for the PJ for the PJ versus the one with the Music Man in it, with the Music Man and the soap bar in the back?
God, I thought I was interviewing you.
Tables are turned.
Well, look, I'm going to start by saying I'm not like the biggest gear nerd in the world, which I know what I like, kind of thing.
That's all that matters.
I mean, when you were talking about Spectres and like you love the sound, but it was the feel of the instrument. I'm big on how, because you play better when the instrument feels right for you, right?
Yep, and everybody's personalized,
Absolutely. Like I love a really low action. I love the kind of slippier feel of strings and the maple neck, and I like the fact that like I do a little bit of slapping. I'm not the biggest slapper in the world, despite what my ex-boyfriends will say. I am not the biggest slapper in the world.
Ellen O'Reilly.
I know. Anyway, so
is this a family podcast? Can I curse on this thing?
You can curse. Like okay. Mark is well used to just me effing and jeffing. Like, but yeah. So, okay. But I like the feel, and I like when you slap the kind of pingy glassiness, as you describe, of the zing of a maple. You know.
Let me ask you this. The maple, to me, one of the great things about it is that when you dig in, you get that kind of the hair on the note. It's not just about that little glassy top. There's also kind of like even a little bit of string rattle. You know, that stuff, when you blend that into a mix, a live mix or a studio mix, sometimes that makes all the difference. I was just checking out, someone posted the bass only, the isolated bass track of Bruno Mars's Uptown Funk. Man, you should hear that bass. That thing is rattling and crangling. It's just like, and then when you put it in the mix, it sounds amazing. It sounds so funky, but it sounds really, really raw on its own. So people like not to be afraid of that sort of thing, you know.
Exactly, but I think that's what gives it the character, and you want it to sound like a bass guitar. It's a guitar. You want to hear a little bit of your finger scratch and all that, the ugly stuff, because when it's mixed in, it's class. You know, because I remember I had we're just having a crack now. I'm like, it's gone for me.
No, go for it. Go for it.
I managed to, do you know Guy Pratt?
Yeah.
He is like my favourite in the world, and I managed to convince him to give me a lesson on Skype, right?
Oh, nice.
And and we were having a crack, and he was just teaching me all his little licks and stuff, because I'm obsessed with him. And he was like, and I was like, oh, I feel like I'm not very clean in my technique when I'm doing this, and an old bass teacher would have given out to me about it, but he was like, no, sure, look, listen to me. And he had strings rattling, and if you were listening, I mean, with Madonna and Michael Jackson, there's things rattling, and sure, like, don't be afraid of that. Like, if just play, I think we get too.
Right.
I think it's good for people to hear that, though, because I think people get. I mean, obviously you gotta have good technique, but don't let that get in the way of being spontaneous. I suppose is what.
Right. And when you're in digital recording too, it turns into a whole other thing. Now that we have this immense control of what we're doing, and some people really do want to kind of zero in and kind of eliminate some of those little idiosyncrasies and stuff like that. If it's going to be that kind of recording, fine. I'll do what the client wants. But there's a lot of tolerance that goes either way. In the middle of all that stuff. Yeah. So when I'm more fascinated than ever when I see people's choices about like what fingerboard, what pickup configuration, whether it's active or passive, 4 or 5, and all the rest of that stuff, because that's the stuff that all put together makes the translation of what you sound like happen. And so the first contact that people have really with your playing as a bass player is the sound of you. It's not that you chose to play a blues note, or you chose to play just the roots, or you chose to reharmonize something. It's the actual sound of something. That's the very first identifying characteristic. So I think people should be, in my view anyway, people should focus on that as much as technique, as much as theory, as much as anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. You're an audiophile.
Yeah, well, that's good and bad, because when it comes time to like mix stuff, I'm just an obsessive maniac, and it's hard for me to get to the point where I feel good about it and can let it go, because I'm just so far inside it. But that's the only way I know how to be.
Yeah, well, it's the right way to be. I mean, it's your music. You're trying to get the best out of it. Like, so after you moved to LA and then you started playing with Dweezil, what way did your career go then?
Well, it took kind of a hard turn. I may have gotten a gig, but that didn't mean that I knew how to be a professional musician and be able to like really make money and hustle gigs and stuff like that. And I don't mean to be like a snob or anything about this, but I had a hard time doing the full-on kind of casual commercial gig circuit, like doing the put on a tux and do the weddings and stuff like that. It was hard for me to find a motivation to do that, and as a result, I went broke. I ended up not. After a couple of years, I left Dweezil's band with Mike Kenneally, who was also in Dweezil's band and one of Frank Zappa's guitarists and keyboardists, and was an incredibly talented songwriter, composer, and artist in his own right. And I had this idea that I would play his music and we would start touring, and we were starting. But what happened was that Steve I called him and and said, "Hey, I'm putting together I'm not putting together." He says, "I'm going to be a part of this this new thing called G3. It's going to be Joe Satriani and me and Eric Johnson." It was the first G3 tour, and he asked Mike to be in his band. It was going to be a 1.5-year tour, and he didn't have a bass player yet. He'd already asked Mike Mangini, now the drummer of Dream Theater, to be his drummer, and so Mike Mangini referred a great bass player named Philip Bino, who is still playing with Steve Vai to this day. And Mike Kenneally referred me, and we had a private one-on-one audition for this gig. And like, no pressure, right? I was 25 years old. And I'd never really lost like a kind of a high-stakes audition like that before, so imagine my arrogance. And I went into the audition, and the material was really complicated, and I nailed it, and I was confident. I felt good. I don't always feel good about after a performance, but that one I was like, yes, I did it. And like, it really, at a moment when it really counted. And I didn't get the gig. And I remember I was just crushed. And so I was crushed and broke. And so I went and got a job at a bass amplifier company called SWR, which doesn't exist today.
I have
but
one
back
right
then
there.
It was. You do?
That's a grey one right there in the corner. It's
I can't see it.
Working Man Pro. Let me check. Working Man Pro 12 combo.
You have a Working Pro 12?
Yeah, right there. And I only got it because John Paul Jones was on the advertising, and I was like, I'll have that.
See, it warms my heart to see stuff like that, because when I worked at the company, I was working with the guys who helped kind of refine the original Working Man's line, which turned into the Working Pro, which I suppose was a bit of a politically correct update. Like, if there's not only men out there working as bass players, right?
Yeah.
And so I took a job as an amp tester. I was already endorsing the product. I remember I came to them. I was like, do you have can I work? Like, I need a job. They're like, well, we've got a job for like testing amplifiers at $8 an hour. I'm like, I'll take it. They're like, are you sure? I'm like, yeah, I'm sure. So I started there, and then little by little, I started, working in every position of the company. I was customer service manager, and then you learn a lot about the products and what needs to be kind of tweaked, and especially talking to bass players out there in real world situations having problems. And then I did artist relations, so that I ended up talking to a lot of other artists, which was very educational about what their needs were for when they're out on the road, what an endorsement relationship is really like on the inside. And then I started managing exports, and so I took my first trip to Europe. I visited all the European capitals and met all the distributors. That was wild. Just one culture after the other, just so different. It's meeting with the Germans is very different than meeting with the Italians, which is very different than meeting with the French, which is very different than meeting from the Brits and the Irish. So it's like, you really, I learned a lot from that. And then I finally got into product development, was working with the engineers, and of course that was a real blast. And so when I see SWR products are still out there, that really warms my heart. But what ended up happening was, a couple years later, I'm like in upper management. I'm like making decisions about hiring and firing, and it was all very high pressure. And I'm kind of like, what happened to me? Like, what's going on? I was writing for Bass Player magazine, not then, but after that. So we'll skip that for now. Anyway, eventually Fender bought the company. The owner sold to Fender, and then for 2 years, I was the guy who was kind of running SWR inside the Fender umbrella. And it was a real education for me, watching a merger and acquisition, and people were getting let go, and we had to transition all the engineering information over to a new team, and trying to teach the salespeople how to sell SWR. And it was just basically I got this poor man's MBA in 7 years over working with this company. And then finally in 2005, I kind of had I don't know if you call it a midlife crisis, but an awakening of sorts. And I was just like, I'm 34 years old. I'm not really playing that much. I've got to get out of this and start over. And because I wasn't broke anymore, I got out of debt, and I was able to make a living and have a life. And I actually didn't mind some of the normal patterns of being a normie, as they say. I liked having a routine, and I liked some predictability, but I just couldn't do it anymore. So I quit, and I started over with no plan. I moved to Nashville, and I just started over. And then in a couple years, I was struggling, and the thing that kind of got me back in the game, ironically, even though I had done work with Steve Vai over that time period, I did some orchestra work with him with the Metropole Orchestra in Holland, and I'd done a lot of touring with Mike Kenneally, but that was intermittent. And I put out a solo album in 2003 called View, which I was happy with, but I couldn't tour or do anything with because I was so busy working. And so 11 years after my audition with Steve, when I didn't get, and in the intervening years after Philip Bino played in his band, Billy Sheehan was his bassist, and I saw that happen, and I'm like, well, I'm never going to get that gig now. But it turns out that in 2007 he wanted to reform the band, and so I got another audition chance, and this time against 11 other people, I got it.
Awesome.
So yeah, so it was an unusual redemption story in a way, but that, and then right after that I ended up in this project called Dethklok, which was a metal band. It's kind of hard to describe because it's based on a television show and the cartoon metal band, kind of like a metal Josie and the Pussycats kind of thing. I'm not even sure if that translates over to the other side of the Atlantic, but it does. Okay, well, anyway, so suddenly I was touring, and I had these high-profile gigs, and that didn't mean that I was suddenly completely financially set. Far from it. I was still kind of subsistence living month to month, but at least I was getting out there. And then in 2011, the Aristocrats started, out of a one-off gig at NAMM, and then in 2013, I got the Joe Satriani gig, and so by 2013, I had finally kind of put it all together. So, and I was 43 when that happened. 42, that's how long it took me to figure out how to be able to make a decent living as a professional musician.
Yeah, that's a great story to hear, though. It's because sometimes people, when they're listening to this, they can get disheartened because they're like, oh, I should have done it sooner, or I should have just stuck to my guns doing this, or I shouldn't, or I mean, I'm sure there's loads of people who've, especially through COVID, have been like, oh, maybe I even did it. I used to work in labs, and I was like looking at lab jobs going, I would hate that. I'll just wait till this.
What lab? What do you mean labs? You mean like science labs?
Yeah, I was a scientist, unbelievably.
Oh, you have a degree?
Yeah.
Did you go to? Yeah, really? See,
yeah.
You have You have a marketable skill. You got a leg up on the rest of us.
I hate it.
I think it was normal. I know that when COVID started and I wasn't sure how this was all going to shake out, I thought about going to get an accounting degree, because I'm not even kidding, because I have always had kind of an unusual interest in watching the numbers dance. I've done the spreadsheets and tour accounting. I managed the Aristocrats for the first 6 years of our existence, and I know how to throw together a spreadsheet and do all that stuff, and I actually kind of like watching everything balance. So I thought, if this doesn't work out, maybe I should just go do this other thing, and I'll never have to worry about job instability or any of the other things that go along with it. But that thought didn't last too long.
Yeah, I'm glad we're all.
I think we all went there. I think everybody who was a professional live musician for a little while was just like, what if this never comes back? They're going to come and take the furniture away. I have to do something.
Yeah, I was like, oh God, I don't want to put on a white coat again and deal with bastards.
Was it government work or private work?
It was. I had a few different lab jobs. I did it for 7 years.
Yeah.
Different, the first one I was working in a quality control thing in a lab for a dairy, because you have to test that all the antibiotics that go into milk. That's why I don't drink milk. It's and then I did a few other random things like that, and then my longest job was in a perfume place and testing all the perfume, the chemicals and all that stuff. And yeah, I was just loads of money, hated it, and I was living for the weekend to go off gigging. I was even pulling sickies so I could go off gigging with the lads. I was like, and then when the 2008 crash happened, which happened all over the world, Ireland, we had a threefold crash, because there was the global economy, then there was the European, then Irish itself had its own. So the company moved to Holland and fired everyone, but they offered me a job in the lab in Holland, and I was like, what's the gig scene like over there? And my Dutch friends were like, not really much, and I was like, right, fuck it, I'm just going to take the money and move to London and study music. That's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to go for it. So
see, that's a great story, and I think that I think you should be proud of that, because only when you have a really, really diversified life experience, I feel like, can you bring You bring that to your playing, but also you bring it to your writing. Do you write? Are you a composer?
Yeah, a bit, yeah.
Yeah,
But
I think
appreciate everything more.
Exactly. And you also appreciate the people who are coming to the shows more.
Yeah.
Because most of them, I mean, maybe with the Aristocrats we have an unusual percentage of people who actually play, but most of them are not musicians. They're just people who have just decided, for whatever reason, that they want to take a couple of hours out of their busy schedule with their families. Maybe they've got kids, they've got a stressful job, they've got something going on. They just decided, for no other reason than because they wanted to appreciate music, to take a couple of hours, spend $10 or $20, 10 or 20 quid, whatever, and come see a show, or buy an album, or even just stream something, And so I think that if you're just coming at it from a purely like, I'm an artist, standpoint, and we all have our artistry, but like the people who are making this work, most of them aren't artists. They just have regular lives with regular jobs. And the idea that they're going to take some time and a little bit of their discretionary income to appreciate and enjoy whatever I'm up to me, that's something that really needs to be appreciated and paid attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. But I want to know, why did you move to Nashville? What was it about Nashville that drew you from LA?
To be perfectly honest, it was a romantic thing. And because I knew about Nashville. We all know about Nashville. And the thing about Nashville, where she's my ex-wife, she lives there now still, and I moved there to be with her. I'm perfectly honest about it. And she's a great musician, and we played together for many years. Her name is Kira Small. And I moved there because she was there. But if she lived in Des Moines, Iowa, or somewhere that was not a professional music town, that would have been much more challenging. We say in the States, there's really only 3 truly professional music towns: New York, LA, and Nashville. And it's not like a snob thing. It's because there's a whole industry of music services that are built around that industry in these places. The availability of instruments and studios and backline equipment and professional engineers and the people who've migrated to these centers. There's just all the resources that you have in order to be a professional musician, to start a tour somewhere from there, to actually record professionally. It's all there. If you live in, Atlanta, Georgia, okay, that's great. There are some professional studios there, but it's not built the same way. There's not the same kind of community, even though a lot of good music comes out of Atlanta. And then if it was a really, really kind of secondary city in terms of population, then you're not going to have any musical services at all. And you realize that when you're on tour and maybe some of your equipment breaks and you're in a small city and you're trying to get a hold of a repair guy or go to a music store that's got something that you can just pick up, and you realize that there's nothing there. If you were in Nashville or LA or Los Angeles, there's 20 different places you can go. So, the idea that I could still be in a music town and start this new chapter of my life was exciting to me. But then when that didn't work out, I moved back to California.
Yeah. So now, you lived in New York as well. Are you from New York?
I'm from New Jersey.
New Jersey. All right. Okay.
It's
did you ever live in New York?
I never lived in New York. This is the equivalent would be like I grew up in Essex, but I never lived in London.
All right, yeah, I get you.
Yeah,
that's like me, Drogheda to Dublin.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I used to go to the city. I'd go to New York, and my whole family's a New York family. My parents are from Brooklyn, which is not Manhattan, but one of the boroughs of New York City. My brother and sister both lived in Manhattan. And my brother is in financial services, and my sister was in the literary business. So everything was very New York City in my family, but I couldn't live there. It's just I'm a nature guy. I needed to be outside in open spaces, and that's one of the reasons why I appreciate Southern California so much. I live in a very small town. There's, it's in the middle of the mountains. It's really remote, actually. People would be surprised probably just how far away it is from everything. But that's because when you're on tour, you're just going from city center to hotel to train station to airport to city center to hotel to train station to airport. It's just nothing but concrete and concentrated people. And that's the way a tour works, because you want to go to places where the most people are, so you have the most chance of selling tickets to the most people. That's the name of the game. So unless it's a festival out in the country somewhere and it's a destination event, why would you go to open spaces? So I like to come home to a quiet, natural environment after I've been flinging myself around the world for
exactly.
however many months I was out that year.
But still close enough to jaunt into LA for when you need to.
45 minutes. Yeah, 45 minutes from LA. 35 minutes from the baked potato, I like to say.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, because I wonder how those three cities compare musically, like, you know, New York, Nashville, and LA. Like, what are the three scenes?
The truth is that I can't really speak to New York that much. I mean, you know, you talk to guys like Tim LaFay, you know, the bass player on the Bowie Black Star album, who's, you know, he plays with Tedeschi Trucks now. He was a New York guy for a long time. You should talk to him. He's a great bass player with a lot of great stories, and he was a real New York guy. And I've talked to other New York guys, and to me, it always just seemed like impenetrable. Like, I think there is a heavy jazz scene there, but also, if you're a bass player, you have to kind of rethink your whole world into like what can fit in a taxi cab, and like what can I travel with, like, on a subway? Like, people do that, you know. I mean, I guess London's got to be the same way. I couldn't imagine not being able to kind of drive my car filled with gear around to the gig, having to rethink that right off the bat. I was just like, no, I can't do that. And then the expensive small living spaces, and it's just, New York is it always showed up to me as a real hassle for musicians, even though I get that it's a great city. LA is perfect, I feel like, you know, for what I'm up to, because in LA seems to me that it's the most open and welcome place for you to do your own thing. That's like, LA doesn't have like a this is LA. LA is like a kind of like choose your own adventure city. And it's a choose your own adventure kind of musical thing too. I mean, yeah, there are circles. There's the TV and film industry, and then there's the kind of fusion dudes, and then there's the rock scene, and there's just but they're all so disparate. It's like you can find your own little niche here, and if you can make it work, it's super cool. There's very little judgment. I mean, yeah, of course, there's an emphasis on youth and good looks and all the rest of that, but that's as old as time immemorial. The key thing about Nashville was I remember discovering when I moved there when I was 34 that I was already starting to become too old for certain gigs in Los Angeles. And then when I moved to Nashville, I wasn't old enough. Like, there were people who had been, you know, hanging in that scene. People say it's a 5-year town. I think it's more like a 10-year town. That, you know, if you hang, you can get work when you move there, but in order to really, really get into the scene, you got to put in the work for a good 10 years. And then there's people who have had the A-list studio gigs there for 20 years, you know, and that's because they've earned it. There's great players like Michael Rhodes, Dave Pomeroy, and God, there's so many unbelievable, you know, session guys there. Dave Rowe, upright player who played with Johnny Cash. You know, I learned to appreciate all sorts of different aspects of music when I was there. And also culturally, just in the United States, it's a whole other conversation to live in the South and get a broader perspective on what living here really is. But, you know, there's definitely a much more focused commercial aspect to what goes on in Nashville than New York or LA. Like, the old school star machine, like, still exists in Nashville. And, you know, the music that supports these artists is still very kind of, you know, simple and by the numbers. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not judging. I really am not. If you want to be in a band and support a pop artist, I mean, today's modern country is yesterday's kind of pop rock. You know, it's not really honky tonk anymore. You know, and there's room for both of those kind of subgenres inside country music, and that's a whole other conversation. But if you want to go and just be a part of the music industry and get on the road and support an artist, I mean, like, you know, go for it. And then it's not like there's not people who can't play. There's some of like, that does not translate into like people playing simple music are not as advanced musicians as they are in New York or LA. In fact, sometimes it's the opposite. That in order to be able to play really, you know, correct pop music, that you have to have a certain set of disciplines that's actually more advanced in some ways than it is just to play kind of like a complicated fusion too. And those people have it. So, you know, like, I have one of the guys I went to Berkeley with is a drummer, not a bass player, but he's had the Brad Paisley gig for like the last 15 years.
Oh, I was just going to mention Brad Paisley. Totally love him.
Right, I know. Well, I mean, he's an example of a guy who's like, you know, a country artist, a full-on old-fashioned country male vocalist, but who's also, you know, he's got that Telecaster, he can play the hell out of it. So there are moments where it does become kind of like about playing as well. But, you know, that guy's from New Jersey, the drummer friend of mine. You know, he was a rocker from New Jersey. We were in a hair metal outfit when we were at Berkeley together called Cat House. and it was like a kind of a low rent extreme thing that we were doing, kind of like a riffy, very kind of pseudo complicated rock stuff. If someone told me, that, oh, this guy's going to be the drummer for Brad Paisley when he grows up, it's like, really? But that's how the business works.
Yeah, it's gas. Like, so, I'm just like, I mean, all the great, you've played with some legendary guitarists. We already mentioned, like Dweezil Zappa, Mike Kenneally, Satriani, Govan. Like, what is it about you as a bass player that works so well with these kind of outlandish, over the top kind of maestro guitarists?
That's like the big mystery of my career. Because, like I said, I did not set out to work in this genre. I was interested in music that was outside the norm, but kind of a little more progressive. Just not straight up pop. I was never one of these guys who really wanted to be in the band that played the hardest music or the virtuoso thing. But on the other hand, I did choose to play bass. So there's probably a moral story in there somewhere, which is that I appreciate complexity in music, but in the end, I still really want there to be a solid foundation, a traditional kind of rhythm section operating that produces tone and groove and a driving feeling. And I just always wanted to be a part of that. And that's the key thing. I always just wanted to be a part of it. I wanted to support it. And I think that in the end, bass is a supportive instrument. And bass is also the most powerful instrument in the band, if you think about it, because it's the only real bridge between the harmonic elements of the music and the rhythmic elements of the music, which is just pure drumming, right, and percussion. And so bass sits in the fulcrum in between these two things. It's a supportive element, but it's also a very powerful element. And that always really appealed to me, being able to kind of, be the power behind what was going on, while the guitarist is out front and the drummer's kind of putting on a show and stuff like that. So aside from that, I don't really know. I just like to play the song. That's it. I just want to make sure that when I'm doing supports, what the guy in the front of the stage is doing. I mean, I stand next to Steve Vai, and I'm watching him, doing these impossible things on guitar, and he's wearing these boots, and he's on one foot, and he's doing all this. And I'm like, if I had to do that, I'd fall over, And then even watching Joe Satriani doing all these things, how does he do that with the sunglasses on? I can't, I can barely see when there's a spotlight on me at all. So, and then of course now Guthrie is a different animal because there's no showmanship in what he does. He just gets up there and just plays guitar like nobody else in the world. And we all know that. And that might be why I've been so comfortable in the Aristocrats, because it's not really, even though, we're playing complicated music, it's not like, there's not pyrotechnics going on there, there's no smoke and lights, there's no pretension or anything like that. It's just the three of us just getting up there and just playing and trying to have a good time, So, your guess is as good as mine. I think it certainly helped that I got the Dweezil Zappa gig right off the bat, and then I started, in that genre, and then one thing builds on top of the other. Mm-hmm. But I've always felt and I don't mean to be humble bragging or unduly modest or anything like that. I've always felt like there are a lot of other guys who could have ended up in the slot that I ended up in. I've done my best to make the most of the opportunities that I've had and tried to sound as good as I could and groove as hard as I can and support the artist as best I can. But, this business is capricious. Mm. There's just a lot of other great bass players, so many great bass players out there that I've run into. And, for one reason, maybe they started a family or, they live in a city and never moved to a big city where people found out about them, or they just decided to make a different lifestyle choice. There's a lot of reasons why things happen the way that they do, and I don't have the answers. I just try to show up and just do my job.
Well, personality too. That's another big thing. If you're going to spend all your time on the bus with someone, you want to be able to get on with them.
Yes, that's true. That's true. So, hopefully I haven't pissed too many people off.
I can't imagine you ever pissing anyone off.
Oh my God, yeah.
You're lovely.
I thank you so much. Believe me, I have my moments. And that's the thing. I think that is a big part of being on the road, is being someone who who people want to be around. I mean, in the end, you're making a decision about people that you can share your life with for 8 weeks at a time. If it's a world tour, you're talking about for the better part of a year. And everybody's got something. No one's Gandhi, on tour. Everybody's got a little something that is going to bug them or set them off, or they're going to have a bad day or something like that. And so I think it's incumbent on you when you're getting ready to, if you want to have a career as a touring musician, to try and find the things that make your day work. And they're really, really basic, like, eating the right thing, and making sure that your sleep patterns are somewhat normal. Just, whatever it is that you do for recreation, if it's physical activity, make sure you get a workout in, or get outside if you need to get outside. All these other things end up really mattering, so that during those 2 hours that you're actually being paid to be there, that you can show up on stage and deliver the best performance that you can, feeling as good as you can, even though you're in an absolutely insane environment going from city to city and day to day. So everybody has their own way of dealing with that sort of things. And yeah, I think part of being successful and getting rehired is making sure that you kind of have that shit under control.
Yeah, absolutely. But I want to talk about, well, I remember seeing you go with the Aristocrats before, and it's such a fun gig. I mean, I know it's like obviously you get loads of like musos, like me and the lads I was with there that time. You get loads of musos and all that, but it's just so much fun. I mean, the music's fun. It's instrumental, but it's fun as well, But your sound is amazing, and all the pedals. I want to talk to you. I want to talk about your backline and your pedals. So what would you use in general?
All right. Well, a couple things there. So the Aristocrats, we're trying, but we're all Frank Zappa fans. So the idea that you can play complicated music and still take the piss out of everything is that the modern construction of that was really kind of invented by Frank Zappa. And so we don't all have the same influences, me and Marco and Guthrie, but that one we share. And we also had all done individual clinics before. So we all had the experience of having to be on stage by ourselves and hold the microphone, hold the room, hold the presence of a crowd. And that's a developed skill as well. So when the three of us got together and we realized that we had all done this, we all were writing our own material on our own anyway. We'd all released solo albums, and we all had done clinics, and we had all done the kind of the talking thing. It was like, we could all just kind of kick the ball around the stage and have a lot of fun with this and make that a part of our show. It wasn't ever really kind of consciously developed. It just suddenly happened that we were all kind of joking around, talking about the origins of our songs on stage. So we want people to come and have a good time. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of notes flying around either way. That's just the nature of the material that we're writing for whatever reason. And we're also doing a lot of pastiches and taking the piss out of certain genres and everything like that, trying to put our own spin on it. But we don't want it to be a recital for anybody. If you want that, go to music school, or go to a classical concert where that's the piece and you play it, and if it's accurately done with some feeling, then that's it. That's fine. But we're there so people can kind of we're trying to break the fourth wall so people can have a good time and be a part of it, as opposed to just apart from it and staring up at people they can't relate to.
Yeah.
So that's my little speech about that. As far as the pedals go, I've had the same pedal board actually kind of for a while. In the beginning, I have a regular old Ernie Ball volume pedal, which is at the front of everything, sidechain tuner on the floor. And then the first effect is Octave, the old brown box, the Boss OC2.
Oh, I have a few of them myself. They're brilliant.
I know, just never get rid of them. Just often imitated, never duplicated. It's still the best sounding one I've ever heard. And then I go into my first overdrive, which is my Exotic Effects bass BB preamp. There's a couple different versions of this out there. This is the earliest rev. And it's not quite as bright as the newer ones, but I find that this is because my basic sound is clean. But when I want to go for an overdrive, I find that it's the most organic kind of Ampeg in a box that I've ever heard. And it even gets more crunchy than your typical kind of, SVT tube head. It's really, really cool and organic sounding. I've used it on a lot of different stages. I've heard it in a lot of live recordings, in rooms. It's just awesome. So that's just that thing is for life as far as I'm concerned. And then there's the Digitech bass driver, which I use behind it. That's a much more kind of basic, bass fuzzy distortion pedal. But it's remarkably versatile. Sometimes I'll use it on its own. It works extremely well when I combine both of those overdrives and then engage the wah. Because I have a Dunlop bass wah on here. You have to drive your bass a little bit in order for the wah to really bite. Because if you don't drive it, then by the bass gets to the wah and it just kind of goes like air. But when you put some overdrive before it, then it goes wow, wow. So, guitarists, because they're operating at different frequencies, don't have, they can play clean and get wah and it'll work. But bassists can't really get away with that. Then I've got a dark glass, what is it? It's a vintage deluxe microtubes. And that's like, a very kind of chingy, kind of almost like rat pedal-y 9-inch nails, kind of jing, 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 because I don't use a pick, so when I play with my fingers, I can simulate that sound if I use that. And then there's an Aphex bass exciter that's right behind it, which gives a little bit of EQ boost because that pedal hits the low end a little hard. I've got a Electro-Harmonix bass microsynth in there. It's a big, clunky pedal, but I feel like it still, to this day, does a better job than any other pedal. There's a lot of great bass synth pedals out there, but just try bringing them on stage and playing live with a band with them. They just get weird and disappear. They don't feel normal. You can't even feel them. It's really strange. This one pedal is the one that does it, and I still haven't found another one that does. And then I get into the modulators. I've got a TC Electronic Hall of Fame reverb. I've got a TC Electronic flashback delay, and then I have a separate Boss DD3 delay. They're set to two different things. And then at the end of the chain, I've got a Demeter Opto Compulator, which it's always on. I just find it's a really good, and I'm not squashing it like like Geddy Lee or anything like that, but it's just at the end so that it just takes all these things going through all these pedals, because this is all just going through one signal chain. I don't have it on a side chain or effects loop. Life's too short for effects loops. It's just one rig, and then at the end I have a couple of exotic effects. I think it's the RC booster that helps me level out my different instruments. I know there's a lot of different ways to do that. It's just kind of a cheap and dirty way to do it.
Nice.
And that's it.
That's a lot.
Oh, wait a minute! I forgot about my chorus. I have a different chorus. I think I said I have the TC Hall of Fame reverb, right? I didn't mention the chorus I have. The chorus is the old Boss CE2B.
Oh, mate, you're a classic fella. I've got one of them as well. I can't go wrong.
Do you really? Oh, it's another one you should never get rid of. They sound amazing. I've there's a lot of good chorus pedals out there. I had the TC SEF, the black square, TC Electronic Stereo Chorus Flanger. Those are really great. I had a Retrosonic chorus for a while, but the guy stopped making them. And then somehow I stumbled on one of these, and I was just like next thing I knew, I'm like searching eBay, like buying every single one that's available. Oh
yeah, you have to have a few backups.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, like with the Boss, God, that octave pedal, God, OC2, the OC2.
The OC2.
I've got like about 3 of them, I think. But I had more, and then when I broke up with the ex, he stole 2 of them.
You were dating a bass player?
No, he was a guitarist. That's even worse. I'm with a drummer now. We're all right. I'm redeeming myself.
You sure?
Oh, fuck. Well, he's not going to steal my OC2s. These do go missing every now and again. He starts wangling around with them, but stealing my OC2s, man, that broke my heart.
That's really terrible. You can always go to Yannick Wisdal, I think, has like 20 of them.
Good man. Go on, Yannick.
You know who that is?
Yeah. He was on this pod as well. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, I've talked to him. What an amazing player.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, listen, I talked a lot about like kind of the hair on the note. I realized that there's a whole other world of playing out there that, has that really smooth sound involving the ramp and, and Mac Garrison, the flamenco technique and everything. I mean, that stuff is just amazing. I don't know how those people do it. I watch them and I'm just like, where do you even start to figure out how to play like that? I mean, Hadrian plays like that. Yannick plays like that. Matt plays like that. And, I think it all kind of comes from the Gary Willis school of playing. Yeah. And anyway, those guys are all fantastic, just amazing.
They are,
and,
but
I'm glad
but
that...
also, we should also appreciate our own, every bass player has their own thing that they're bringing to it. So, this comparing yourself to anyone else is shite. It's not going to be good for you.
Yeah, but I'm just, it turns into, I'm glad they're doing their thing so that I can do my thing, And it's the same way that I feel about guys like Victor and Billy. I'm glad that they're doing that so that I can do this.
Yeah, exactly. Well, what amp though are you using? Obviously not SWR anymore, no?
Yeah, it's a funny thing. I'm using Gallion Kruger, and I have ever since I think 2010 or 2009 or something like that. And this was a really it's funny because when I was at SWR, Gallion Kruger was the competition. So I would see Bob Gallion, the founder and owner of the company at the show. We'd say hi. And then the guys who were at the Ampeg booth, and we all knew each other. Nobody was shitty to each other or anything, but we were business competitors. So anyway, when SWR kind of ceased to exist, I think it was around 2008, it became obvious that there was no longer a workable way for me to be able to get SWR backline. I was just going to have to use something different. So I went to, I looked at my Rolodex and I kind of went to the people who I knew who were still at these companies, and I said, well, because everybody heard about SWR going down. So I was like, looks like I got to start playing another amplifier. And everybody already knew kind of how OCD I was about amplifiers and about tone. So I said, I'm going to go to SIR. I'm going to rent a big sound room for the day, and I'd love to try out as many kind of full-blown touring rigs as possible. Can you help me? Can you put a word in an SIR so that if I go there, I can just kind of get a rig from their backline stock and just give it a shot? And they were so generous, the Dave Boonshaw from Aguilar and somebody from TC Electronics had their rig, and I had a hard key rig, and everybody was just so nice about it, It's just we have a really great community, I feel like. And so I had 7 or 8 rigs up there, and after about 4 hours of testing, it's hot, I'm sweating, and I've got, what I do is I don't just play in the rigs themselves and I play with my pedal board, I test it out with overdrive, but then I take backing tracks and just blast the shit out of them in the monitors. Just so loud that it's almost painful. And then play bass against that, because that's what playing a real live show is like. It's the best that you can simulate. Yeah. And you learn about a rig real fast like that, an 810 stack or even 2 810 stacks. You just learn about the way the preamp and the power amp deliver the note, which is kind of a hard thing to describe, but we all know it when we feel it. Some people like a really soft, pillowy note, and I think that's what the Aguilar tube heads and the Ampeg stuff, they deliver that better than anything out there, because you want to have something that's kind of soft and bloomy. That's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for something that's as fast as possible. That is the immediate response from the second I touch the string. I can feel it, almost like a little kick drum went boop, in my back. And to me, it was clear that Gallion Kruger's, amplification speakers were delivering that for me better than any other amplifier line. And I was surprised myself, because I played the old Gallion Kruger 800 RB and stuff, and I've always known it as a good amp, but I just hadn't played one in a while. And they had this new line of products called the Fusion line, and it had a tube preamp. It was a hybrid preamp with tube and solid state circuitry, so it was like the Gallion Kruger fast, transistor circuit, the one that we all know and love, but also had a couple of extra preamp tubes in there for warmth. So it was kind of like a slightly SWR flavored Gallion Kruger amp. And the power amps in those things, they were just kicking. I couldn't believe how powerful they felt. So when it was over, I called everybody, I thanked everybody, and then I called Bob Gallion, and I was like, well, I'd love to use your stuff, what do we do? And so that was the beginning of our relationship. And then, eventually I went and visited the factory, and we had dinner, and sat down with his son, Forrest, who works at the company, and Jason Finley, who's the GM there. And, we all kind of shared war stories over the last 10 years about the products that we put out and whose products were in Guitar Center and who was running ads and all the rest of that stuff. It was such a fun communal experience to be able to kind of speak to them on that level of not just, in a player endorser backline, but also from a business standpoint and company standpoint. And, so there was a real bond there. And I got to tell you, I've brought the GK stuff around the world, and I've had some of my favorite musical experiences on stage sonically. And I'm so picky. I'm so picky with monitor mixes. I'm so picky with the way I want it to sound. And GK has done a great job of delivering for me with Joe Satriani, with Dethklok, with the Aristocrats, and even in local gigs. So I can't say enough about how great their stuff is and how great they've been to me.
Oh, well, you're in a very unique position, really. I mean, just in general, right? Because not only are you like an artist, a composer, teaching online, you've been a clinician, you're a musician in general, right? But you've also been on the inside of the music business in terms of like from the magazine point of view, like a journalist point of view, and also from the manufacturing of instruments and amplification and all that. So you've been in the music business from all parts, really. It's
I didn't realize it kind of while it was happening. I was just trying to go where the next opportunity took me. I already told you why I took the job at SWR. I was broke. It wasn't my intention to learn the ins and outs of the music amplifier manufacturing industry, but that's what happened. I always wanted to be a writer, even when I was in high school. And so when the opportunity came to write for Bass Player Magazine, I was super, super excited. And I got to write some first-person columns for them. Just basically like write whatever you want, as long as it's got to do with bass somehow. And I got to write 18 back-page columns like that. It was just an absolute dream come true. But I learned even more, honestly, after I left Fender SWR and started writing for the magazine again, when I was actually doing staff writing, interviewing people, reviewing CDs, doing spotlight articles and all the rest of that stuff. To be on the receiving end of people who were looking for publicity, because that's a part of our business. If we're not out there telling people what we're doing, how are they supposed to know? And especially back in 2007 and 8 when social media existed but wasn't like this everything that we have right now. So getting to talk to guys like Christian McBride on the jazz side, I did a cover story on him, even though I wasn't a big jazz guy. That was, I learned a lot there. And Chris Wolstenholme, from Muse, what a sound, right? That was a super fun interview. Justin Chancellor from Tool, I got to do a cover story for. I mean, I've been very, very, very fortunate. So, it certainly wasn't a plan. I just kind of kept doing the next thing there was to do. And I think Mike Kenneally is the one, I don't know where he got this phrase from, but he says it in his interviews. I think it's one of the wisest things I've ever heard, which is you get points for continuing to show up. Like, that's it. But listen, this also, there's realities that everybody has to deal with. I mean, the decisions and risks that I've taken probably wouldn't have been realistic or possible if I had kids. And I don't. Some people have serious family issues that they have to tend to. They have a relative who's falls ill and they have to take care of them or something like that. For a couple of years, that changes people's lives. There's all sorts of things that can affect your availability and to be able to kind of go on a moment's notice to one city or another and turn your life upside down completely, because a lot of times that's what this industry demands of you in order to succeed. So I think that that's something that you kind of have to factor in and continue to factor in and continue to factor in, because that decision process is different when you're 25 and then when you're 30 and then when you're 35 and then when you're 40 and then when you're 45. And you got to decide if you want to just kind of keep doing this.
Yeah, and that the people around you understand.
That's right, because they don't always,
That's it.
So that's why you're with a drum. That's why you're with a drummer, right?
He actually has a normie job too. Like he's he's a radio researcher, so he uses this room as well. But yeah.
See, there's no wrong way to do this. That's what I'm trying to say. There's no wrong way to do this. there are a number of people who are making their living, just as touring or just doing music exactly the way they want to do it. I mean, like, that's just a tiny sliver of a tiny sliver, and nobody's got it made. Everybody's got their own little kind of struggle that they're going through in order to make it work on a day-to-day basis. So just keep doing your thing.
So Brian's advice is you keep doing you.
Yeah, exactly. That's how the kids would say it these days, right?
Yeah,
you do you. Is that
think.
the phrase? I'm hopelessly outdated these days. You see all these gray hairs? I didn't used to have
Well, I
these.
recently got mine fixed, so we're all right.
Okay, excellent.
We're kind of like colleagues then with Bass Player magazine.
Oh yeah.
I suppose we are. Is that right for them too?
Okay. Well, and that's for bass player. Is it bass player? Is it Guitar World Bass Player? Future Publishing, right? Yeah, you mentioned Joel McIver, so yes. Yeah. Yeah, I know. I mean, there's a long, tradition of we're all standing on the shoulders of somebody else, right? So, I mean, I remember when Jim Roberts, the original editor of the very beginning of Bass Player magazine back in the late '80s when it first came out. I remember reading that magazine when I was a kid, and there I am in LA. It's 6 years later, and I've got this Dweezil gig, and I don't have a lot of money, but at least I got this gig. And Mike Kenneally had been called by Fender Guitars to come and try out some new instruments for them on an R&D basis, just give them their thoughts. And then they were working on the very first Fender Active Jazz basses. This is back in 1994. And they were asking Mike if they knew any bassists who could come down and try them out. So Mike referred me, so I went there, I'm trying them out. And I'm sitting there, and I'm 23 years old or whatever, and I'm doing my whack-it and playing around, and blah, 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 blah. And there's a guy sitting in the corner, and there's some Fender R&D guys over here, and blah, blah, blah. And so after 20 minutes of playing like 3 different basses and, playing, every lick I knew and trying to figure out how to try out basses, I didn't even know back then how to try out basses. They go, thank you very much for your feedback, and da-da-da-da-da. And this guy from the back of the room, who'd been just sitting there with his legs folded and his arm crossed the whole time, comes walking forward, and he goes, you sound really good. I didn't catch your name. I said, I'm Bryan Beller. And I said, who are you? He says, I'm Jim Roberts. I'm the editor of Bass Player magazine. If I had known that the editor of Bass Player magazine was sitting in the back of the room while I was sitting there going wang-it for 20 minutes, trying out all these basses, I would have had a heart attack, because it was Bass Player magazine. It was a big deal. So anyway, he decided he wanted to write an article on me, and I stayed in touch with him, and that was how eventually I started to get to know the team of people who worked there, and eventually some of them went on to be editors and all the rest of that, and so yeah, I mean, I'm glad that Bass Player continues to exist, and that you're writing for them, and I think it's cool, because I don't remember in the 90s when I was working there, I don't believe they had a female writer on staff.
No, I don't think so. I'm not. Well, I came from when I moved to London in 2011. I won a scholarship to go and study at this bass college, and a part of my award was to write a column for it. Well, it was called Bassist magazine, then became Bass Guitar magazine, still Future Publishing, and then we joined Bass Player American, and now we're all one. It's Bass Player all over the world now, but it's Future Publishing, yeah. But yeah, so I'm kind of writing for both. Well, it's the one thing now. But yeah, I mean, I was the same. I stacks, still have stacks in boxes of just all the magazines, obsessively reading them, and then winning the scholarship, and then being able to oh right, you're doing a column. And then afterwards, when Joel became the editor, he was like, Ellen, I really because I was only meant to do 1 year. He was like, I really like the way you write. Why don't you work for me? I was like, oh my god, class. Yeah,
that's great. That's great.
And now I'm working for Talkingbass as well, so I'm like, oh yeah, I get paid to talk bass. It's brilliant.
I mean, I am not going to sit here and pretend that I know how the world of content will look in 5 years, let alone next year. I would like to think that there's still a place for the traditionally accredited media, for lack of a much better phrase, to be able to put the spotlight on up-and-coming players, as well as today's headliner established players. And also the the kind of the classic gear, to teach people about why certain gear is classic, and also to showcase new and upcoming gear. and what's exciting, all the rest of that stuff. I'd like to think that there's still a voice for that. That's not just, somebody put a tweet and then somebody else linked to it and it either goes viral or it doesn't. I think there's a place for informed, authoritative voices in today's media landscape. It's just a part of the landscape, as opposed to kind of like we're all just sitting there waiting for the next issue of the magazine to come out like we used to in the old days. It's definitely an adjustment, and all we can do is just adapt to our environment. I mean, like that's the story of being an entertainer, right?
All right, so everyone, you can find out all you need to know about Bryan at bryanbeller.com. Aristocrats have a new live album coming out soon, isn't that right?
That's called Freeze, live in Europe 2020.
Brilliant. So that'll be coming out, and then also Bryan also has his own solo album, concept double album called Scenes from the Flood. So check that out at bryanbeller.com.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you so much.